All right, it's time for our final panel, increasing access to mobility in Africa through mini grids. We're chatting to one of our partners, ABSA, and the moderator for this panel is Justin Schmidt. He's the head of new sector development at ABSA Retail and Business Bank. Justin, are you there?
I am. Hi, everyone.
Justin, I've heard that you have had an extremely busy day today, so I'm very glad that you could join us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. Glad I made it.
All
Good
right,
to be with everyone.
You are going to be our moderator for today, so please introduce our panelists, and the floor is yours.
Perfect. So today, the session now, the last shift of the day, and I think there's a bit of a renewable energy flavor, but if I can introduce where I come from, I'm not going to do very much of the talking today. But at ABSA, I look after our tourism, manufacturing, and renewable energy sectors in the retail and business bank side. So an interest in today's topic from a few angles. And then the actual topic is increasing access to mobility in Africa through mini grids. And then essentially how do electric vehicles, batteries, and renewable energy all come together? So I'll ask the simple questions and let our panelists kind of build the story for us in understanding microgrids. So the first panelist that I'd like to introduce is Rebekah Shirley. I'm not going to embarrass everyone by giving their full bio. I'll let them introduce themselves. But Rebekah is the Chief of Research at Power for All. I think a lot of us in the energy space know that entity. And then she's the visiting research fellow at Strathmore University. So Rebekah, over to you to introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you so much for having me. As mentioned, I'm the Chief of Research at Power for All, as well as visiting research fellow here in Nairobi at Strathmore University, and an Energy for Growth Hub fellow for Africa and the Caribbean, so this is quite exciting. I'm so happy to be at the event. Essentially, I work to implement collaborative approaches, electricity service, in particular ways that distribution utilities, mini grids, and productive use companies can cooperate to reach communities at lower cost. And I also work on understanding the opportunities at the intersections between electricity and other sectors like agriculture and mobility. So thank you again for having me. I think that the opportunities here are endless, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because we're talking about this intersection between electricity and the mobility sectors.
Perfect, thank you. And on to our next panelist. So Shantha Bloemen is the founder of Mobility for Africa. Welcome, Shantha.
Hi. So I'm started a startup in Zimbabwe where we're testing micro transport solutions in a rural community, especially focused on women. So we're testing out micro mobility with tricycles and a battery swapping model, and trying to link it to productive use energy and off-grid energy. I have a background in development, worked for 20 years in the UN, many of them on the continent. So coming very much from the perspective of how do we reach the majority of Africans who often are far away in rural areas and often ignored. So that's our priority.
Cool. Perfect. So we'll unpack a lot of that and kind of misconceptions that I might have when I think about mobility and electric vehicles. But yeah, let's unpack that as we move through. Next, I think Francis is here, but we've got Francis Romano, CEO of Knights Energy.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me?
We can see and hear you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, thank you. So I'm Francis Romano, as you say. I'm the CEO of Knights Energy. We are located in Nairobi, and our main focus is the transition to e-mobility, from ICE to e-mobility, with a special focus of energy in transport and particularly renewables. We're looking at the use of renewables in transport sector, both in the urban setup and in the rural setup. So mini grids would apply in the rural setup, and that's what we are trying to see. How does e-mobility work in the underserved areas? Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. And then next, we've got someone who was load shed earlier today. so hopefully there is no load shedding at the moment out there. But Dr. Remeredzai Joseph Kuhudzai, founder of Electric Drive Africa. I can see you there. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. Yes, you got it right. Remeredzai, yes. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I am the founder of Electric Drive Africa. So we are a Pan-African platform where we travel across Africa to share the stories of what's happening in the electromobility space. I also have renewable energy space, low carbon energy systems, focusing on solar as well, and material science. So it's good to be here. And I also spend quite a bit of time in Nairobi, so I know Francis quite well. And yeah.
Cool. So we've got Kenya, Zimbabwe, and South Africa represented, and a few other countries based on where you've all lived in the past. So let's jump into it, and I think the main heading for the event or this panel, just one ground rule. I think I'll ask specific people the questions, but if you want to jump in, please, it's conversation. So just add on to the other panelists' points if you do feel like adding on to the question I asked them. But let's jump into this mini grid. A common understanding of what mini grids we're talking about. So if I could throw it over to Rebekah and just ask you kind of when we're talking about mini grids, it was noted, rural versus less of the common mini grid. But could you just define that for us so we've all got the same understanding of what we're talking about? Thank you.
Yes, sure, absolutely. So right now, our distribution systems and energy markets are largely centralized, which is not necessarily a bad thing because centralization means stability and opportunity for whole systems optimization. But especially as we're moving towards a future necessitating resilience to climate change, our networks have to be able to make decisions for themselves. And that's where mini grids come in. So a mini grid is also, sometimes the audience might have heard of a microgrid or an isolated grid. This is a set of electricity generators and energy storage systems often that are interconnected to a distribution network that supplies electricity to a localized group of customers. So this is usually a small scale electricity generation, like maybe anywhere from 10 kilowatts to 10 megawatts, that's serving a limited number of customers via distribution network, and that can operate in isolation from the national electricity transmission or distribution network. And as Francis was saying, this is really important because then you can have these sort of modular units that are allowed to be in areas where transmission network may not already exist. And therefore, by decentralizing electricity, we're also decentralizing the access to mobility.
Does anyone want to add on to that definition? Were you all happy?
No, I am happy with that definition. It's quite good. But a mini grid also allows the presence of energy where in the conventional system, it's not possible to put it there. So that this starts making it very interesting. But now if you're looking into mobility, you start wondering, can I also have dig my own oil well in the backyard? It's very similar to that. If the energy you're using in transport is immediately available to you, it changes the entire spectrum of transport. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, maybe just to add, Justin, that what's happening in the energy space, and Rebekah is one of the main experts here, but obviously there's been a huge investment in especially in East Africa in mini grids, over $2 billion committed to investing in energy access. And while energy access is obviously a critical goal in itself as part of the SDGs and everyone's right to electricity, obviously what that electricity is going to be used for is now the big question. And so while we see rural projects where there are increased households now with solar home kits and other types of energy products, the potential which we're exploring at Mobility for Africa is how do we link that to practical things that we know serve a very important purpose for improving livelihoods or improving access to services. And we know that in the continent, not only is there an energy crisis, but there's a mobility crisis. Most people don't, especially in rural areas, have access to safe, affordable, regular transport. So it just seems like we're at a very exciting opportunity in history to bring those two tracks together, so to speak.
Perfect. So
I'd add just one more thing to that, Kristen. Oh, sorry.
Sure.
No, I was going to say, to add on to what Shantha said, and we can go like this all evening. But one of the interesting things here at this intersection is that for the mini grids, so as Shantha was saying, there's been an explosion. There's about 4,000 mini grids in different stages of development across the continent, which is fantastic to see. But the commercial model is still yet to be proven. And one of the things that mini grids struggle with is demand and demand stimulation. If there's enough demand, then that increases their revenues, that brings down their effective costs. And so also rural mobility represents an opportunity to actually help the energy sector and not just the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So I'm going to unpack that in a few follow-up questions. I think, from our perspective, we see it locally in South Africa with load shedding hitting. You talk about agriculture, farmers producing cash crops and essentially now going off grid for a portion of their farm. So in the commercial space, we are seeing that business case where it's about the lost revenue. But I suppose then we're talking about someone who has a lot of wealth already in a business that's established that is now kind of going off grid. We've also seen it in the tourism space where people don't want to see these power lines or hear the diesel generators. And so we've seen that kind of market as well, where I think then, but again, there's you pay a lot per night at those lodges. So they're driven by different commercials. But let's jump into all of that. I think let's talk about the leapfrogging. It was mentioned now, and it's part of the description of today's panel. But this is supposed to be the most exciting leapfrog since the arrival of mobile phones in Africa. And I think everyone's kind of touched on why that's the case. In my mind, kind of when we look at it as a bank or you look at it as economists, you need access to that information, data, that sort of thing, so you can see why digital revolution is great. And then the flip side, what we need to rebound from lockdown, from COVID, is probably access to funding, which is where the banks come in. But more importantly for me here is normally we would say cheap, reliable energy. But I think when you have no energy, let's just start with reliable energy, which is where microgrids come in. So the question, let me throw this over to Francis. In your mind, why are microgrids plus RE, plus batteries, plus EV something that is essential in this next leapfrog?
Thank you. From our perspective, especially looking at rural areas and underserved areas, one of the key deficiencies in those areas is access to those places. Because you might say access to energy, but access to the place, first of all, is the issue. And this is a question of mobility. So mini grids provide that quick leapfrog to access to those places, simply because the energy becomes accessible through the mini grid. But now the mini grid provide a simple and cost-effective method of accessing those places, especially if you're looking at going to school in the morning, especially in such places, the schools are very far. You're looking at a simplest, cost-effective way to go to school, do the necessary day-to-day activities. So the leapfrog is into immediate opportunities for development in those places. We are not saying that they are going to go into manufacturing of anything. They are simply able to move from a not possible scenario to a possible scenario simply because the energy is available and the method of transport is also available and supported by a sustainable form of energy. This is our perspective.
Great. So I suppose in my mind, I'm thinking about it the wrong way, right? Mobility, you think Tesla, you think the trucks, that sort of thing, thinking, from a commercial banking perspective. But it's actually when we talk about mobility, that's such a key point, I suppose, that access to that area that you couldn't get to before. Thanks, Shantha.
Sorry, just to say, I think we're also talking about micro-mobility. So, we know that Tesla requires most probably a bit more power than my tricycle that we're testing. But essentially what we're talking is last mile and first mile. You're not going to do away with the fact that a rural community has a market center where there's going to need to be a truck, but you have huge distances. And you've got to remember that 70% of the population of the continent is still rural. I know we're having a dramatic growth in urban areas, and we have to deal with that, and urban transport needs to be a priority. But the fact is we still have enormous amounts of the population in rural areas, and we know that the economic drivers for agricultural development are critical to the continent's success. So we need people to stay in rural areas. So, you know, if you can make small-scale farming a little bit more easier, because remember at the moment, small-scale farming produces most of the food on this continent, yet it is most back-breaking work because people have to walk 5 to 10 kilometres to get their tomatoes to a place where they can be sold. You know, they have to carry basic items. So if you're talking about a 3-wheeler or a 2-wheeler that can be productive and easily charged using, you know, 3 to 4 kilowatts of power, then you have a potentially, you know, you're stimulating lots of levers of economic growth in a rural community, and it's not going to solve all the isolation, but it's going to make it much easier for the truck to come once a week and collect everything that needs to go to town, because everyone could have got all the cabbages and be ready for shipment. So I think it's just, I keep on stressing this because I think sometimes we sit in Joburg or we sit in cities and we forget where much of the continent still lives, and that is in rural small-scale farming. So just to give my pitch, especially women, we're talking, you know, the majority are women and they do the most back-breaking work, and that's, to me, one of the other things we should be pushing. If they can drive a tricycle and not have to carry 200 kilos, then that's a winner, isn't it?
Yeah. And also, just to add on to that, what Shantha is saying, we're not thinking Tesla, because the majority are in the rural areas where most of the roads aren't paved, and it's difficult to access. But if you have small 2- and 3-wheelers now, and the beauty of the technology where it's going, we now have batteries which have high energy density, these small lithium-ion battery packs that you can charge for 2 kilowatt hours, it's full, and then it can take you for 70 kilometers. It can be put on a small electric bicycle or on a motorbike or a border, and then you carry your goods with it and you go to the market, or it becomes like a mini ambulance to take people to clinic, or a taxi to take children to school. So the beauty about it, the small microsystem is like, these all systems also then land in Africa at affordable price points to fit into existing models. So these people are starting to get into home solar systems via the pay-go methods. So now they've been adapted to the pay-go system. So now if you just, they started with just lights and playing a radio and charging your phone. And then they were upgraded to now a small bar fridge and things like that. And now they've been upgraded to small power tools. Maybe you can have a small barber shop powering some hair clippers. So now it's just an incremental effect. Now we can add a 2 kilowatt hour bicycle or 3-wheeler and then charge and put it in the same system where they also can pay per day on the pay-go system, something that they understand already. So that is actually where the synergies between the two are going to drive each other: the mini grid and also the mobility, the micro mobility.
And I suppose that's something for us to learn in Johannesburg as well, where it's difficult for us to get our heads around something like ABSA and Mkopa, and where people are paying daily or weekly, where we have these monthly repayments and not, as you get some money and you pay. So again, with mobility, the mobile phone revolution and all of that, I think there's a lot for us to also learn from payment models and how to adapt to your customer base and support your customer base. So that maybe takes me to this 1 to 10 megawatt, where kind of that's, Rebekah, I think you said that's the range of where we are. I suppose this micro mobility, etc., that's probably on the lower end of that range. You're not going to see the 10 megawatt. That's probably more that, and not even that farm I'm talking about. That's probably more of a community. And my question was to understand between the two sides, how do you plan for this? Remeredzai, based on your experience earlier today, where you were load shed, how do we make sure that there is enough kind of infrastructure there to grow with the demand? If there is demand there already, and we starting to plug things in. How do you plan this sort of system to make sure that, that's also not unreliable eventually?
That's the beauty of how microgrids are set up. They're all scalable and modular. So I think the model people have been looking at finding an anchor tenant. So you build it around maybe a cell phone tower or a clinic, someone who will be your main anchor client, and then you roll in all the community. So the anchor client, in a way, sort of subsidizes the community in a way. And then you can scale it up as the community grows. So starting off with maybe a 2-kilometer radius, and then you spread it on to 4-kilometer radius, depending on how the system is and the ecosystem and the environment is growing and developing as well. That would be, because that's the beauty of it being scalable.
Can I just?
And if I could add,
sorry, go ahead, Rebekah.
Sure. No, okay, thanks, Shantha. If I could add to that, there's a lot of work happening right now coming from some of the major companies that work in solar home system and mini grid technology, like Zola Electric and so on, Zola / Off-Grid Electric and so on, where we're looking at ways to make because the mini grid it's modular, but there are ways to make the system even more modular by having interconnectivity between modules or nodes within a mini grid system. And so there's a lot that's happening right now to make it such that down to the level of the node, i.e. the household or the commercial center, mini grids can be very expandable. So that research is really fantastic to see. And another thing I wanted to just bring up is that, again, just to the intersectionalities that we're all talking about, Shantha brought up a really great point earlier about the connectivity to agriculture and agricultural labor, and also on of course on the farm side, but also on the value addition side, things like milk chilling, things like cold storage for herbs. Like there's so much that also requires either an energy as heat or energy as electricity. And I think, again, there's this really natural connection between exactly what Dr. Remeredzai was saying, between the small, compact batteries that are, sitting on 2- and 3-wheelers, and the fact that these can be basically swapped. In fact, I think Wim was saying earlier that this is really one of the big opportunities with battery swapping is with the 2- and 3-wheelers. And so you sort of have a chargeable, but also controllable energy storage that the mini grid developer can actually control and use to support all of these other needs. And so you start to see a real natural connection between agriculture / food security, mobility, and energy access. And we're basically adapting these solutions to the way that people already live, to the places that people already live.
I mean, Justin, just to give you the context, because we've been piloting now for 18 months. I mean, look, we've learned as we go, and we didn't start with a mini grid. We started with testing out how to do electric tricycles in a rural area. And to be frank, I underestimated how much power we would need. So we invested in 10 gigawatts, and we've added another 10 gigawatts, and we know that we need a better charging design. So to me, there's a lot to be invested in terms of how we build a replicable model and a scalable model. But what we've got to do is bring some of these actors together. So at the moment, you've had, people exploring EV independently of maybe the conversations around independent energy producers. So, I mean, we at MFA have built our own off-grid energy. We didn't intend to, but that's what happened because we didn't realize. So now going forward, our model is how do we look for potential partners in the independent energy space and say, well, we'll come on board and we'll bring mobility solutions and we'll buy power from you and set up a battery swapping system. And I think what we've heard today is we know the price of batteries are coming down. We know, the huge investment going into the OEM battery world. I mean, Tesla makes another breakthrough every month, a big one. So essentially, there's a huge amount of research that can be leveraged. It's just got to be applied to areas that often, to be frank with you, bankers think are unviable because they're in the informal economy and there's not lots of obvious data sets to go and explore. So finding the CapEx investment you need to say, let's get this town or this community moving and invest, $200,000, $300,000 in a mini grid plus mobility, but the cost in the long run is enormous. And the battery swapping system we've been using that system. Look, it's not without its challenges, but women pay when they get a fresh battery. People want. It's like going to the petrol station. And then we know in most rural parts of the continent, petrol is not easy to find. So, the sun charges and you get a new 60 kilometers on your tricycle that day. So there's a lot of potential. I think what we do need now is to sort of have some more courage from the banking sector. I'm going to put you on the spot to sort of take some risks and, and push this area, because if you do link it to agricultural productivity and small scale farmers, it will be bankable, because, often people are producing a lot, but they just don't have that access to market. So anyway, I think it's a really interesting space, but the potential now of trying to move the energy sector closer to the EV world and us closer to the mini grids is where we can really find some exciting leapfrogging, so to speak.
So luckily I'm the moderator, so I don't have to be put on the spot and answer questions. I'll give my thoughts. I'll give my thoughts just now. But I did want to open, because as you were talking, I wanted to ask then Francis. Okay, so how do we drive that viability and and you're talking about the IPPs, and clearly that's where someone will come in, put their capital in. Whether it's through crowdfunding or whatever that platform is, and eventually, hopefully, banks come in as well and support it. But in your mind, how do you, is it that chicken and egg? I mean, how do you take a view on as an IPP then coming into the space and building the infrastructure? So for me, I think, let me just it's one of those difficult things that you always look at cash flows, even for a bank. Even funding of solar, or as a commercial bank, financing the IPPs through power purchase agreements. It's normally the utility scale projects that you fund, and the bigger projects. So, there's a lot more kind of lawyers in a room, and you get a quicker understanding of that, or a better understanding. So even for a commercial bank to kind of get their heads around it, it is very much moving away from lending against security and figuring out what those cash flows are. Mm-hmm. So, it's something that we push as well. We figured out how to lend to IPPs in South Africa. You've clearly got a great off-taker, maybe as a big corporate, but it is a step forward. And then just funding solar, thinking about it in terms of financing the actual cash flows, knowing that adds value to this business that you're supporting, these small scale farmers, whatever it is. So I do think there's a shifting of our mindsets, and we also have SDGs. We do want to support women entrepreneurs and that sort of thing. So it's also aligning to what your goals are, and then figuring out a better way. Like I said, the daily repayments and stuff like that. We need to figure better sources out. Or partnering with our clients that do the crowdfunding. And sometimes, some of these, it is maybe just the crowdfunding and finding the right resources. And we are looking at kind of ways of doing some stuff similar to that. Francis, I see you back. Do you want to?
Yes, thank you. Just to try and respond to that. Looking at it from the Kenyan context, I would say that there is already enough mini grids that have been installed. And one of the ways is to optimize the utilization of those mini grids, and transport is one of the areas. In situations where mini grids
if Francis is having difficulty, I can try to take a stab at what his answer might have been as his Kenyan colleague.
Please proceed.
I can hear Francis. I'm not sure. I can still hear him. Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. So thank you. So if that's the case, in the Kenyan context, it's possible to spur the growth of underserved areas using mini grids. They're already there. They're already existing. It's possible just to introduce the transport sector to that. And if it comes in a manner that in itself it has a commercial element, then the people utilizing that energy are able also to pay little by little. So it's a question of adding to what is already existing in the Kenyan context. In other areas where the mini grids do not exist, then the question of who will construct the mini grids would become relevant. For example, an IPP would come in, if not a public body or a government body that wants to create them. But in the East Africa context, I see a lot of mini grids coming up. So it's an easier way to drive mobility than not, in my opinion. I would say let's just add the technology to it. Let's have some bicycles out there. This is actually what we want to do ourselves. This is what is going on in Kenya.
I think as they get bigger as well, that's the other side. My view is also I'd take a whole bunch of households and a lot of cash flow to look against rather than one customer. So I think then as it carries on growing, it becomes easier for everyone to take that risk view of the project. I think maybe just to understand then, are there any technical considerations? We heard earlier, when you talk the bigger kind of charging of vehicles and maybe there's technical constraints. Is there democratization of this mini grid? So is there anything you need to consider when planning these sorts of projects in terms of access for everyone and across all technologies to that infrastructure? I don't have anyone in mind, so someone could put their hand up and take that.
I mean, Joseph most probably, Dr. Romano knows most probably a lot, but just to say from our experience, what we're trying to design now is how do you justify the investment in a mini grid operation that's going to provide enough power to service a big enough fleet? So it's getting that balance right. If you have, so we're trying to create now a formula for 100 tricycles. So if we know we need that much energy, and that's a considerable operational investment to build, a charging station that's going to service 100 tricycles on an assumption that they want to travel 300 kilometers, 400 kilometers a week, and we want to meet demand. This is the challenge, that you have customers who learn the fruits of traveling, instead of long days walking. So you've got to meet that demand. And we've in our own pilot have had huge challenges meeting that demand because we've underestimated the energy needs. So essentially it's both, I think, it's what the mini grid is producing in terms of energy, what type of battery you're using, and how much energy it needs, then the charging infrastructure. And what we know is that, the household solar kits aren't going to give you enough energy to reliably solve the household battery needs. It's much better to have a battery swapping system where you take that burden on and you invest in the faster charging or the more efficient charging operation, rather than have each individual household charging. Because the other thing, and not to be critical, but the other thing is when you look at mini grids is the focus has been on putting cables house to house, distributing to a household. Now that's most probably something we think of more in a traditional city setting where you want to turn on your light at home. But essentially in most parts of, rural life, you're moving. You want productive use energy to move with you, which is what Rebekah was alluding to with the productive use potential of batteries, so that the batteries ultimately, you don't need to spend $1,000 putting a cable to my house. I'm going to give you access through a battery swapping system. So when I need energy, I go and, swap my battery and pay for that battery power. And now I can use that for my mobility, but potentially I can use it for my grinder or my fridge or the other priorities I have at home. But I can take it with me. So it's mobile productive use energy. And I think that's also exciting. So, I think it's moving from thinking that, in a city, everyone needs a connection to their house. And that's what we learned from mobile phones. No one needs a landline anymore. Which mobile company is laying cables? So we've got this new potential to do the similar thing, and put the money that you would spend in a cable into perhaps a battery charging system in a community. And then you can potentially aggregate that to shared mobility. So it's not whether I can own my own tricycle, but can I benefit from the transport services available, either by a rental or by a transport and logistics service. But it's thinking in slightly different ways about how we apply what's been done in urban areas into a rural context, which is challenging. We know that from our experience in Zim. It's not without complexity, but I think the exciting thing is that it can be done.
Maybe speaking exactly.
Sorry. Me? Go? Okay. Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good, because I couldn't hear Frank earlier. I just wanted to jump off of Shantha's point again because it was so well made. So right now in Uganda, we're doing a pilot that looks at integrated approaches to electrification, as I was mentioning earlier, and actually looking at approaches where a mini grid can come into a community and set up a central hub. So in the area where there are the mamambogas, the stores, etc., the salons, and have solar home system providers or these other modular mini grid, like the Zol Electric, serving the households in the peripheries. And then once that, and the goal of setting up the system that way, such that the mini grid can actually grow the demand on behalf of utility, and then you can have utility come in, and a year, 2 years, 3 years later, and have already a system that where the demand is enough such that it's financially feasible for the utility to do this. And I wanted to bring that pilot up because I think that in the conversation about rural mobility, we often focus on the mini grids, but really this is a conversation that the utilities should be a part of as well. There's a lot of sense in it for the utilities, especially if they can think about rural customers and the ability to use integrated or collaborative ways of reaching those customers as benefit to them and to their bottom line as well. And so in this pilot that we're testing, which is just about to commission, we'll be able to understand really what is the right compensation mechanism, for instance, for a utility once the grid does reach to these rural communities for those assets, and what are the models for mini grid being able to take up certain assets, say a charging station, and either leave that and be compensated for it or move to other communities. And so there's a lot that's happening in this space. And I think that I just wanted to make sure that, especially from a financing point of view, utilities have access to very low cost capital, and so that we shouldn't leave them out of this conversation on rurality.
Yeah.
Dr. Remeredzai, did you have something to add there?
I was just going to add the same points that Dr. Rebekah has added.
Yeah, maybe I can add something small. If I wanted to borrow money from a bank to do a mini grid out there, I would go to them and say, give me money to build a house, because they would not understand what the mini grid is. Then I will actually go and construct the mini grid, which will give me more money than the house, because the product is not understood. But the energy you spend in transport will return faster from the mini grid, as opposed to if you invest it, say, in the conventional ways that we know about it. It's just that we have not tried out those methods. For example, if I do a mini grid and potentially I charge all my batteries during the day, the cost of charging is so low compared to having purchased that energy from even a grid provider. It's that low. It just depends on how I design my mini grid. So from an energy perspective, the mini grids that exist out there would pay much quicker if they added transport as one of the off-takers of the energy that is currently being generated. So what do we need now? We need the solution to go down to the last mile. We need the bikes there. We need the two-wheelers, the three-wheelers that can withstand that terrain. But as soon as that is correct, and those 2 to 3 wheelers are electric, then the mini grid will easily support that transport, because the mini grid will be by any chance cheaper than oil to do the same thing per kilometer. So it all depends with convincing the financier to come on board, and if not, still getting finance to still do what will still bring the returns. Thank you.
So there were follow-up questions, but I see the audience has some. One that we'll see if we can come back to is kind of the intermittency of renewable energy, and I suppose where you're charging everything. There's that question that you can't have everyone charging at one time. But this There's another that banks also like, the regulation and that question. But Jean-Claude Guessa, I hope I've said that right. How the distributed power is regulated, since many countries have heavy regulation on power production. So does anyone want to take that? Because I think that's the beauty of mini grids. You start avoiding that regulation. So yeah, who wants to take that question?
I can start with answering part of it. The beauty of mini grids is it makes it slightly easier. Part of the regulations are in place to sort of like supervise or protect the grid. For example, if you want to connect a solar power plant, and let's say it's 1 megawatt in the city, there has to be a grid impact assessment. What's that 1 megawatt going to do on the substation down the road, and vice versa, things like that. So whereas in the distributed sense, you have less of those things, and also so it's actually more flexible to proceed with the distributed space in the mini grid and the off-grid sectors as well. So it makes it easier to advance these mini grid projects.
Yeah, cool. I think that answers it.
I would add to that, though, that there are definitely a lot of challenges in terms of regulation for mini grids. In fact, sometimes the lack of clarity on the regulation is the challenge for mini grids, the challenge with permitting and so on. And what I'm starting to see some of the more progressive energy sectors do is develop off-grid regulations specifically for the mini-grid sector. So Uganda, again, where we're working, has done this. They're currently in draft. Things like that make it really clear what the mini-grid has to do, what its compensation mechanism if there's grid arrival, or what those options are. Those are really important to making it faster for mini-grids to expand.
Yeah, from our perspective, I think when we see off-grid, like why we see some of those farmers doing this is so that they are not regulated, because it takes so long to get the licensing or anything like that. And some of them have taken the view that, well, let's be off grid. And in our minds, then we would just want to know that it's technically built the right way. But otherwise, that's kind of, in my mind, the great thing about these solutions, that you really do democratize and decentralize. The next is also about regulations. That's clearly a big topic with energy. It's from Gad Ashir-Bor. The existing regulations on the continent cater for the grid in the main. Countries are not sort of figuring out their way about regulating the distributed energy space. So I suppose that's a follow up. So I suppose there's the question: if it's connected, it has to be regulated, right? So figuring that out. But who wants to take this question?
I'm saying that I think in Rebekah's previous answer, she had clarified that part, that different countries have not put together mechanisms and regulations on how to govern mini-grids, but several are developing. And usually the problem is when the mini-grid is exceeding a specific capacity. How do you handle it? Because it goes into the space of retailing, distribution of energy, even if it's in a short space. So I think for smaller mini-grids, and especially if they are government-supported or public mini-grids, then this problem is not there. But when you construct a private mini-grid, then in this case, you've got to receive the correct licensing depending on capacity, area of coverage, and other reasons. So before a mini-grid comes up, all these things have to be answered. But the presumption here is that the mini-grid has been regulated and has been licensed to operate. Then what happens to the energy generated thereafter?
Maybe bring it back to this EV discussion, because I think one of the challenges is also how do you get the ministries of transport and the ministries of energy to sort of talk to each other, and we know that's a bigger issue on EV. But if you're looking at strategies, I mean, it's a policy. You want a holistic policy framework if you're going to be working in this space, and I think that's one of the challenges. There's separate ministries, and the transport people like licensing fees and registration, and they're maybe not thinking in terms of how do we move with the energy sector. So there's a lot of work to be done in the policy space, I think, generally, to bring the two conversations closer together.
I see studios on the screen, so I think we might get told to stop.
Like a wind down or when it's time to end the discussion, we just pop in.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. How are you doing after the last mile?
We're ready for a drink.
We're doing good,
thank
thanks.
You.
Thank you so much, team. It really has been a very informative discussion and a great way to end day 2 of EV Day
Yeah.
with ABSA here at Smart Mobility Africa. Thank you so much.
It really has been. Yeah, just pulling together all those final pieces of the puzzle, batteries, electric vehicles and renewable energy. Great way to end Electric Vehicle Day. So thanks everyone for that.